The quiet formality of the congressional hearing room deepened as Judge Aileen Cannon adjusted her glasses, the dark line of her robe sharp against the polished wood panels behind her. Across the table sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, the Texas Democrat many assumed had stepped into a career-ending confrontation. The air was thick with tension. Before we break down how a first-term lawmaker from Dallas methodically challenged a federal judge's reasoning on national television, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss how legal expertise met unwavering political resolve, and share in the comments where you're watching from. This exchange is echoing across the country. Moments earlier, Judge Cannon had entered with the calm of someone long accustomed to control. She came prepared to defend her controversial rulings in major cases, and most expected her to move through the hearing without difficulty. Republicans on the committee had treated her like a returning champion. But Jasmine Crockett arrived with something few anticipated. Beyond her law degree from the University of Houston Law Center, she carried years of experience as a public defender who had argued before judges even more formidable than Cannon. Crockett had spent the night before studying every opinion Cannon had issued, every legal article she had written, and every possible weakness in her stated philosophy. "Your Honor," Crockett began, her tone steady but sharp enough to capture the room's attention. "In a 2019 decision, you wrote that judicial restraint is the cornerstone of constitutional interpretation. Could you explain how that aligns with your recent rulings, which legal scholars from across the political spectrum describe as examples of judicial activism?" The room stirred with reaction. Republican members tried to interrupt, but Crockett continued. Judge Cannon's composure shifted slightly, just for a moment. No one had expected such a direct challenge. The youngest black woman ever elected from Texas was questioning a federal judge on her own legal ground, and the nation was watching what would become one of the most striking oversight exchanges in years. To understand the moment, it helped to know who these two women were and why the confrontation mattered. Judge Aileen Cannon, appointed to the federal bench in 2020, had become a lightning rod in legal and political circles. At 42, she was young by judicial standards, with experience at Gibson Dunn and as an assistant U.S. attorney. Her reputation, however, rested not on her resume, but her rulings. Critics accused her of shaping decisions to fit political interests, while supporters praised her as a strict constitutionalist resisting government overreach. Conservative media had built her up for weeks as a legal mind, ready to expose what they called partisan attacks. Outlets like Fox News presented her as the expert who would outmatch Democratic critics. The Federalist Society issued statements commending her reasoning. To many conservatives, she was untouchable. Jasmine Crockett, however, was not a conventional opponent. At 41, the Dallas-born attorney had earned her standing through hard-fought legal work. Before joining Congress, she built her career as a civil rights lawyer who took difficult cases, and often won them. She represented clients who couldn't afford counsel, challenged systemic inequality, and gained a reputation as someone who prepared thoroughly and argued fearlessly. Her preparation for this hearing was exacting. While others planned broad questions on philosophy, Crockett's team reviewed every ruling, lecture, and interview by Cannon, identifying contradictions and inconsistencies that suggested her principles shifted depending on circumstance. The stakes were immense. This was not only about one judge or one lawmaker. It was about the credibility of the judiciary itself, the limits of accountability, and whether checks and balances still held firm. The hearing streamed live on C-SPAN, aired by major networks, and trended across social media even before the gavel struck. Committee. Chairman Jim Jordan had organized the session as a show of support for Cannon, a platform to counter what Republicans framed as unfair criticism from the left. He offered her extended time, a full opening statement, and favorable questioning. But one key factor was overlooked: Jasmine Crockett. Judge Cannon adjusted the microphone, projecting confidence and authority. Her 20-page statement was filled with citations meant to establish her command of the law. Crockett sat quietly with a single folder and a legal pad, taking notes. To outside observers, it looked like a clear mismatch: an experienced judge versus a newcomer. Commentators online described Crockett as a novice about to be schooled. They were mistaken. The atmosphere grew tense. Democrats like Jerry Nadler and Adam Schiff exchanged looks of curiosity. Republicans such as Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene seemed certain of the outcome. Cannon began with the calm tone of a judge used to being unchallenged. "Members of the committee," she said, "I appear before you not only as a federal judge, but as a defender of the constitutional values that have guided this nation for nearly 2.5 centuries. Criticisms of my record are, in effect, attacks on judicial independence itself." Republicans nodded approvingly. Jim Jordan applauded. For 15 minutes, Cannon cited case law and precedent, invoking Scalia, Madison, and the founders, constructing an argument grounded in tradition. Her Republican colleagues followed up with easy, supportive questions, allowing her to expand her narrative of judicial impartiality under partisan attack. When Representative Gaetz asked whether her critics were merely upset about rulings they disagreed with, Cannon replied smoothly, "Congressman, when a judge applies the law without political bias, there will always be those who wish for political outcomes. I will never be a politician in a robe." Applause followed from the Republican side, and conservative media quickly shared clips online, framing her as the voice of judicial integrity. Then came the Democrats' turn. The early questions focused on her rulings, but made little impact. Cannon deflected with ease, invoking independence and precedent. It appeared she was in full control, until Jasmine Crockett leaned forward to speak. Each case carries its own facts, and the law must be applied accordingly. Perhaps if you had attended law school, you'd understand that. Republicans burst into laughter and applause. Schiff froze, caught off guard. Judge Cannon had just insulted a sitting member of Congress on live television and faced no consequence. Her confidence had turned into open arrogance. Jerry Nadler tried next, probing her legal philosophy. Cannon dismissed him with thinly veiled contempt, suggesting his questions showed a lack of constitutional understanding. By the time Jasmine Crockett's turn came, Cannon was riding high. She had deflected every Democrat's challenge. The hearing felt choreographed, almost like a planned victory. Conservative outlets were already preparing celebratory headlines. Crockett began calmly, almost conversationally. "Judge Cannon, I'd like to start with something simple. In your 2019 opinion, State of Florida versus Jackson, you wrote at length about stare decisis, the idea that courts should honor precedent. You called it," she glanced at a page, "the foundation upon which legal consistency and public trust in the judiciary rest." Page 47. "Do you recall that?" Cannon nodded, slightly puzzled by the soft tone. "Of course. I stand by every word." "Excellent," Crockett said, pulling a document from her folder. "Then perhaps you can explain why, in 7 cases over the past 2 years, you explicitly deviated from your own precedents without any change in law or fact." The smile faded from Cannon's face. Crockett continued without pause. "To be specific, in United States versus Chen, March 2022, you wrote that prosecutorial discretion is nearly absolute and should not be second-guessed by the courts. 4 months later, in United States versus Williams, with almost identical facts, you ruled that prosecutorial discretion is subject to extensive judicial review. The only notable difference was the defendant's political affiliation." Cannon drew breath to respond, but Crockett raised her hand. "I'm not finished, Your Honor, and in this chamber I have the floor." The room fell silent. No one had spoken to Judge Cannon that way before. "In your confirmation hearing," Crockett continued, holding up another transcript, "you swore you'd never discussed your judicial philosophy with political groups. Yet I have a video from a 2018 Federalist Society event where you gave a 45-minute presentation on that exact topic. Would you like me to play it?" Cannon flushed. "Congresswoman, I believe you're mischaracterizing—" Crockett cut her off. "Because I have the video right here. Shall we watch together? I'm especially interested in the part where you say, quote, 'Judges have a duty to interpret the law in ways that advance certain societal goals.' That doesn't sound like the neutral arbiter you claim to be today." Republicans tried to intervene. Jim Jordan struck the gavel. "The gentlewoman's time is limited." "I have 7 minutes remaining, Mr. Chairman," Crockett replied without looking up. "And I intend to use every second." She turned back to Cannon, who was gripping the table. "Judge Cannon, let's talk about United States versus Patterson. You dismissed charges citing prosecutorial misconduct, but I have internal emails, obtained legally through FOIA, from your chambers showing you decided to dismiss before hearing arguments. One email from you to your clerk reads, "We need to find a reason to dismiss Patterson," dated 3 days before the hearing. How is that not prejudgment? Those emails are taken out of context, Cannon managed. Here's the context, Crockett replied, her voice rising for the first time. In the last 3 years, you ruled in favor of defendants sharing certain political views 94% of the time. That's not blind justice, that's political bias in a robe. Democrats erupted. Republicans shouted objections. Jordan hammered the gavel, calling for order. Crockett pressed on. I have a statistical analysis from 3 major law schools, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, covering over 500 of your rulings. Their conclusion? Your methodology shifts depending on political stakes, stricter standing for liberal cases, looser for conservative ones. Textualist one day, purposivist the next. These accusations are outrageous, Cannon said tightly. Are they? Crockett lifted a thick packet. Because I have 73 pages of examples. We can go case by case. Let's start with Environmental Defense Fund, where you suddenly found standing barriers you'd rejected 2 months earlier in Americans for Prosperity. Chaos swept the room. Republicans demanded silence. Democrats insisted she continue. C-SPAN cameras caught Cannon's shock and Crockett's steady composure. Jordan threatened to clear the gallery to restore order. When quiet finally returned, Crockett's tone carried the calm certainty of someone who knew the momentum had shifted. Judge Cannon, one final matter, perhaps the most important. She lifted another document. United States versus Thompson. A single mother of 3 charged with failing to report $8,000. She faced 5 years. You denied every motion for leniency, stating, "The law must be applied equally without regard to personal circumstances." Crockett let the silence linger. That same week, United States versus Hawley, a wealthy executive who evaded $3.2 million in taxes. You granted every defense motion, allowed months of delay, and sentenced him to probation. Your words. The court must consider the full context of the defendant's life and circumstances. She looked directly at Cannon. Explain to this committee, and to the American people, why a mother trying to feed her children goes to prison, while a millionaire who dodged millions walks free. Cannon opened her mouth, but no sound came. The silence was overwhelming. Let me assist, Crockett said quietly. Ms. Thompson had a public defender. No campaign donors, no social ties. Mr. Hartley's lawyer, however, sits on the board of the same conservative legal group that recommended you for this judgeship. His wife serves on your state's judicial selection committee. I'm sure that's purely coincidental. Applause broke out from the Democratic side. Several Republicans lowered their eyes. The evidence was clear, documented, specific, impossible to dismiss. Cannon tried again. You're taking these cases out of context. Each situation is unique. Context, Crockett repeated sharply. I've worked as a public defender. I've begged judges to consider context for my clients. Judges, like you said, the law is the law. Strange how context only matters for those with influence. She picked up her phone. I'd like to show you something. This is a video from Ms. Thompson's 14-year-old daughter, recorded yesterday after learning you'd be testifying. The screen lit up with a teenager's face. Judge Cannon, you sent my mom to prison for trying to take care of us. She admitted her mistake, but you said our situation didn't matter. My little brother cries for her every night. We lost our home. I had to leave school to work. You let rich people who stole millions walk free. How is that justice? The room went still. Some in the gallery wiped tears. Cannon's composure faltered. Crockett's voice remained calm but firm. That young woman wanted to be here, but she couldn't miss work. Unlike the defendants who receive your leniency, her family is still living with the results of your decisions. Crockett spread out more files. I have 47 similar cases. Single parents, hourly workers, people who made small mistakes and faced your harshest sentences. And 23 cases where wealthy, well-connected defendants walked away with minimal punishment. The pattern is unmistakable, Your Honor. 2 systems of justice, one for the powerful and one for everyone else. Cannon attempted one final defense. Congresswoman, you're not a judge. You don't understand the complexities. I understand perfectly. Crockett shot back. I understand that you've forgotten what justice truly means. I understand that your courtroom has become a political instrument. And I understand that you've betrayed the oath that robe stands for. She gathered her papers, then paused. One last question, Judge Cannon. Answer carefully, you're under oath. Can you watch that young woman's video and honestly claim you've applied the law equally to everyone before you? Cannon remained motionless for 10 seconds. Dozens of cameras caught every silent second, a question that should have been simple for any judge. Chairman Jordan finally struck the gavel. I yield back, Crockett said, returning to her seat. The damage was complete. Cannon's prepared remarks were useless against the evidence before her. When Republicans tried to restore her credibility, her responses were hesitant and weak. The earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by visible unease. The hearing technically continued for another hour, but the result was already clear. Every question afterward circled back to Crockett's documented examples. Democrats, energized by what they'd witnessed, pressed for further details. Some Republicans stuck to their talking points, but the momentum had shifted. Even members of the majority appeared uneasy, as the written record on the table defied dismissal. When Judge Cannon finally left the witness chair, she moved quickly, avoiding the gallery's gaze. The woman who had entered with absolute certainty now appeared shaken, exposed, and, most damaging of all, unable to defend her own record. Within minutes of adjournment, Crockett's 7-minute exchange spread across social media. Crockett exposes Cannon topped global trends. The teenager's video went viral, viewed millions of times as both legal experts and everyday viewers analyzed what they had just seen. Legal communities dissected each of Crockett's cases, matching them with public records, and her claims held up. On CNN, legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin looked stunned. In 4 decades of covering courts, he said, I've never seen a federal judge so completely dismantled in public. Fox's early spin dismissed it as a partisan attack, and a primetime host called it political theater. Yet even some conservative legal figures hesitated to defend what had been revealed. In The Hill, Professor Jonathan Turley wrote that the compilation raised serious questions about judicial bias that should not be dismissed as purely political. By midweek, the Judicial Conference of the United States had launched a preliminary review of the issues identified during the hearing. 3 state bar associations called for formal ethics investigations. Scholars from across the ideological spectrum signed an open letter urging accountability measures to address what they described as a pattern of deviations in judicial conduct. Yet the impact extended beyond one judge. Crockett's approach, meticulous research, targeted examples, and a clear pattern quickly became the new standard for oversight of the federal judiciary. Law schools began incorporating the hearing transcript into advocacy and professional responsibility courses. The teenager whose message had cut through legal jargon found herself at the center of a national conversation about sentencing fairness. Donations flooded in for her education, and she spoke on reform panels about how a judge's ruling can affect an entire family. Her mother's case soon became a common reference in debates over equal justice. Judge Cannon attempted to withstand the criticism. She issued a carefully crafted statement dismissing the hearing as a political spectacle and maintained that her rulings were legally sound. But as independent analyses mounted and additional decisions matching the same pattern emerged, her position became increasingly difficult to defend. Within 3 months, she was quietly reassigned to a reduced civil docket. Several of her controversial rulings were overturned on appeal, with higher courts citing clear legal errors. The judicial system's language for the deeper issue Crockett had laid out in plain terms. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett rose to national prominence. Her alma mater established a scholarship in her name. She received invitations from the American Bar Association, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and law schools across the country. Her social media following grew by millions. More significantly, a criminal justice reform bill she had long supported, previously stalled in committee, suddenly gained numerous co-sponsors. Still, she kept the focus off herself. In a 60 Minutes interview, Crockett stated, "This was never about me versus Judge Cannon. It was about the promise that justice is blind and the law applies equally. When judges forget that promise, it's our duty to remind them." Politically, the hearing disrupted expectations. Republicans who had intended to uphold Judge Cannon as a symbol of judicial persecution found themselves retreating to safer ground. Senators who once praised her judicial philosophy began qualifying their support. The Federalist Society no longer featured her as a speaker. Democrats, energized by the hearing, initiated broader inquiries into systemic bias. They adopted Crockett's method: show the pattern, prove the inconsistencies, and connect them to real-world outcomes. Within 6 months, 3 other federal judges faced similar scrutiny. 2 chose to retire rather than undergo public hearings. Legal scholars later referred to the event as a turning point. Harvard's Lawrence Tribe wrote that Representative Crockett had accomplished more in one hearing to restore faith in congressional oversight than years of prior efforts, demonstrating that thorough preparation and evidence can still hold power to account. The lasting image was not Cannon's confident entrance or her uncertain departure. It was the split screen at the hearing's climax, Crockett standing firm behind a table covered with documents, and the judge, silent, unable to answer whether she had applied the law equally. 6 months later, the teenager from the video received a full college scholarship from an anonymous donor. The note that came with it read, "Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Keep going." People speculated about the sender, and the mystery only deepened the moment's lasting impact. Cannon's reputation never recovered. Historians would later observe that her public standing collapsed not from official discipline, but from a question she failed to answer. Crockett, meanwhile, continued her work in Congress, now equipped with national visibility and bipartisan esteem from legal professionals who might oppose her views but respected her mastery of the case details. When a law student asked what guidance she would offer those confronting authority, Crockett replied, "Do the research, understand their history more thoroughly than they do, and never forget facts equalize. Authority may frighten, but it cannot defeat proof." Change extended beyond that single hearing. New measures for judicial openness emerged, featuring regular reporting on sentencing trends and systematic reviews to ensure fairness across comparable cases. Experts developed the Thompson-Hartley test, named for the 2 cases Crockett had contrasted, as a method to evaluate whether the law was applied equally to different defendants. A year later, the ABA honored Crockett with its Champion of Justice Award. She presented it to public defenders advocating for impartial treatment and to defendants who had been denied it. The applause continued for 5 minutes. A leading legal blog captured the moment. Crockett didn't just win a viral moment. She elevated expectations for judicial accountability. Every federal judge now understands their decisions are being monitored, and trends, positive or negative, will be examined years later. Judge Cannon addressed the hearing in just 1 paragraph of her memoir. "I was not ready for the depth of analysis Representative Crockett presented. Looking back, I should have been more conscious of how my rulings might appear collectively. Every judge can learn from that experience." It was her nearest approach to an acknowledgement. The case files Crockett cited were digitized and released to the public, soon becoming a fundamental tool for scholars examining judicial prejudice. The Brennan Center for Justice introduced the Crockett database, tracking national ruling patterns. In its first year, analysts detected concerning trends in multiple courts, leading to focused reforms impacting millions. Yet the deepest transformation may have occurred among future lawyers. Watching a first-term representative systematically dismantle a well-guarded narrative using original documents, structured reasoning, and calm discipline inspired a generation's view of advocacy. Law school applications from underrepresented groups increased sharply, with numerous candidates naming the hearing as their motivation. In the courthouse where Cannon had once served, public defenders noted quiet but meaningful shifts: fairer plea discussions, more thoughtful sentencing explanations, and a broader awareness that each ruling could later be seen as part of a wider trend. The fear of being the next judge publicly revealed as biased served as a strong restraint. 3 years after the hearing, Congress enacted the Equal Justice Act, requiring yearly analysis of sentencing differences and creating a civilian oversight panel for federal courts, a law often called Crockett's Law. At the signing, Jasmine Crockett stood behind the president, holding the same folder she had brought into the hearing. That simple manila folder, overflowing with documents, turned into a symbol of a straightforward truth. Authority is not evidence. Documentation is Ms. Thompson. The mother whose case had stirred the hearing was eventually freed on appeal, her sentence reduced to time served. When she walked out, Crockett greeted her. A photo of their embrace, surrounded by her children, became one of the year's most shared images, often tagged with a phrase the teenager had uttered. Justice delayed, but finally delivered. Law schools nationwide began incorporating key hearing segments into professional responsibility courses. The final question, "Can you honestly say you've applied the law equally?" earned a shorthand, the question. Professors used it to gauge judicial integrity, asking students how they would justify their own decisions under similar examination. Judge Cannon eventually left the bench for private practice, specializing in corporate compliance and helping organizations prepare for strict review. She avoided public discussion of the hearing, though associates noted she kept a photo on her desk, not of herself, but of Crockett at the podium. It may have served as a reminder of how swiftly influence fades under the light of truthful accountability. The impact continued to spread. Courts implemented dashboards to identify unusual sentences. Confirmation hearings for judicial candidates incorporated data-focused inquiries inspired by Crockett's model. Lawyers coined the phrase "pulling a Crockett" to describe revealing inconsistencies using the subject's own statements and rulings. 5 years after that pivotal day, Jasmine Crockett was sworn in as a federal judge, nominated by a president who praised her unwavering dedication to equal justice and confirmed with cross-party support. In her inauguration speech, she pledged always to remember that justice centers not on the judge, but on the people in the courtroom. Observers noted the fitting conclusion. The person who posed the question would now be accountable to it, measured by the same standard she had asked others to meet. Soon after, at a graduation ceremony, the young woman whose video had captivated the nation received her law degree. The keynote speaker was Judge Jasmine Crockett. "Years ago," she told the graduates, "a courageous teenager reminded this country that behind every case file and docket number, there is a human being. Justice is not an abstract idea. It is personal, and it must be equal for everyone." The audience rose in a standing ovation as that young woman, now a lawyer, announced she would become a public defender. A documentary called "The Question: How Jasmine Crockett Changed American Justice" aired to critical praise and earned several Emmy Awards. It included scholars, defendants affected by unfair rulings, and even judges who said the hearing made them reconsider their methods. A former clerk, speaking anonymously, voiced what many were thinking. "That day changed us." We all wondered, could I have answered that question? Beyond the United States, the hearing was cited by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in a report on accountability. The European Union invited Crockett to speak on legislative oversight. Law schools in Tokyo and London developed case studies around her approach. A decade later, the Harvard Law Review ranked the confrontation among the most significant congressional hearings in American history, alongside the Army-McCarthy and Watergate hearings. The editors noted that where other hearings revealed corruption or abuse, this one exposed something more widespread: the subtle, systemic bias in justice that quietly denies equal treatment. And it sparked lasting reforms. On the 10-year anniversary, NPR aired a retrospective featuring people whose lives were changed by the reforms that followed. A small business owner described avoiding prison under fairer sentencing rules. A wealthy executive told of being held properly accountable under standards that ignored his status. Public defenders spoke of judges who gave clearer explanations and applied the law more consistently. One of the most powerful interviews was with Ms. Thompson's son, the little brother, who had cried every night, now a criminal justice student. He said, "Representative Crockett didn't just expose one judge. She showed us someone was watching. She gave us hope the system could change." And it did. That same day, Crockett released a memoir titled "The Question," with proceeds funding legal aid. "I walked into that room with a folder and a question," she wrote. "I walked out with a movement. But the real heroes are the families who lived under unequal justice and still found the courage to speak up." For the first time, Judge Cannon, then fully retired, issued a brief statement acknowledging what many had long believed, that the hearing marked a turning point for American justice. She described accountability as responsibility, not persecution. Observers noted it was the closest she had come to accepting the validity of what had been revealed. Over time, the standard Crockett championed took root. Bias once hidden in individual rulings became visible when mapped across a judge's entire docket. The question, "Can you honestly say you've applied the law equally?" shifted from a rhetorical challenge to an expectation backed by data and review. The teenager at the center of it all became a public defender, then a reform-minded prosecutor, and ultimately a judge. Judge Jasmine Crockett administered her oath, completing the circle. "My mother went to prison because a judge forgot that justice should be blind," the new judge said. "Today, I swear never to forget." Historians would later mark the hearing as the moment American justice began moving back toward its ideals. Not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. And it started with a first-term congresswoman from Texas who did her homework, brought evidence, and asked a question a federal judge could not answer. The folder Crockett carried that day now sits in the Smithsonian, part of an exhibit on moments that changed the nation. Beside it lies the transcript, open to the final exchange. Visitors often stand for minutes, taking in the simplicity of the question and the weight of the silence that followed. A small plaque reads, "On this day, Representative Jasmine Crockett reminded America that truth, armed with evidence, can still confront privilege and win. Justice is not about who you are. It's about what is right." Each year, first-year law students watch the footage, the judge's confidence fading, the congresswoman's steady resolve, the moment a question became a reckoning. Faculty tell them the lesson isn't to seek drama, but to build a record so solid it speaks for itself, methodical, documented, and fearless. The hearing room itself gained a new informal name, the Crockett Chamber. A small plaque by the door bears her words from that day. "Justice isn't about the judge. It's about the people who stand before us." Anyone entering to testify or question sees a reminder that authority is temporary, but accountability endures. In legal casebooks today, Judge Aileen Cannon's name serves as a caution, a lesson in how patterns, once fully seen, can overshadow any single opinion. In those same pages, Jasmine Crockett stands as the representative who reset expectations for how the people's branch can oversee the judicial one, armed not with bluster, but with facts. Oversight, her work showed, is not theater. It is the guardianship of equal justice under law. If this story moved you, pitting courage against privilege and proof against power, share it with someone who needs to remember that systems can change. Leave a note about a time you saw truth prevail, or a time you spoke up when it was difficult. Justice is not a favor given by the powerful. It is a right we defend every day. And as that day in the hearing room showed, sometimes everything turns on one question, asked at the right moment, with the